It's early autumn 1950, and we're in the Philippines. It's night time, and we're on a hill on the outskirts of a village. This is where a squadron of soldiers has set up camp. There are about 300 men, mainly local peasant farmers, and members of an anti-government guerrilla group called the Huks. They've been threatening to kill the locals in the nearby village as a form of protest. But on this particular night, the Huks' attention is elsewhere. A group of them is on a trail that leads through the forest, not far from camp, crowded around something they found on the ground. Earlier in the evening, one of their men had gone missing, and they've come out to search for him. They found him, but they're too late. He's dead, and his pale, lifeless body is sprawled on the ground before them. They are utterly terrified. They'd expected to find bullet wounds, but on closer inspection, they noticed 2 puncture marks in the dead man's neck. His body has been drained of blood. The men run for it, pack up their camp, and leave as quickly as they can. In the Philippines, people talk about the existence of a merciless, blood-sucking creature called the aswang. These men had heard rumours that there was one living on this hill, and it looks like it's just claimed its first victim. This is a strange tale about the power of stories and myths. It's one of the most chilling accounts to come out of the Cold War, and it reveals the lengths colonial powers were willing to go to maintain control. This is True Crime Reports, a global crime show from Al Jazeera. Today's episode, the Philippine Vampire Mystery. Our story starts at the beginning of the Cold War in 1947. Picture this. The Philippines is a country of more than 7,000 islands, with a population of 17 million people who speak over 120 different languages. It's got a rich, vibrant cultural history, but it was left in ruins after the Second World War. And in 1947, as the new threat of communism looms ever closer, the Filipino government is worried. So they approach America and ask for help. American military bases pop up all around the Philippines. Hundreds of millions of dollars flow into Manila for equipment and supplies, and tens of thousands of Filipino soldiers are trained up, ready to fight against the rising danger of communism. However, not everybody's delighted about the Americans' presence in the country.
Although the US and the Americans in general were held in high esteem by many Filipinos, there was still a significant segment of the Filipino population who regarded the Americans as returning colonizers rather than as liberators.
This is Michael Pante. He's a history professor at Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines.
Given the extensive damage sustained by the country after the war, the widespread poverty, it's not surprising to see many working-class Filipinos taking on a rather radical path towards social change.
Now, in 1947, the Philippines has only very recently gained independence. It had been an American colony for nearly 50 years, and before that, it was ruled by the Spanish for over 300 years. So when the Americans start moving in their troops again, having only just left, some Filipinos are angry. In particular, a group of local peasant farmers who call themselves the Huks.
Huk stands for Hukbong Bayan Laban sa Hapon, which literally means People's Army Against the Japanese.
The Huks are a communist guerrilla group who'd come together in 1942 to fight against the Japanese occupation during World War II.
The Huks played a significant role during the war as a guerrilla force, but unfortunately, after the war, they experienced different forms of harassment coming from the pre-war landed elites, from the Philippine government itself, and even from American soldiers. That eventually led to them waging a rebellion against the Philippine government.
For the Huks, Forming an alliance with America, when they've only just shrugged them off, is unthinkable. And so in 1948, the Huks, led by a war hero called Luis Taruc, turn against their own government and the American forces roaming their lands. The Huks are a formidable force. They pillage villages and stage high-profile murders of Filipinos they see as aligned with the government, landlords, local officials and military officials. And their numbers are multiplying. By 1949, there are more than 11,000 of them, both men and women.
Guerrilla warfare was, and I think still is, it all boils down to getting popular support. And this support was crucial in terms of ensuring the safety of the Huk rebels, securing their access to food, ammunitions, intelligence gathering.
The Americans are worried about this growing anti-government group. So in 1950, Washington decides to act. They send out a man called Edward Lansdale, and this is where our story starts. Lansdale is a 42-year-old army officer. He's slim, with short cropped hair, a neat moustache, and narrow, searching eyes. This is what he'd been up to pre-1950. Back in America, he'd started out as an advertising executive. He and his wife Helen lived in San Francisco with their 2 kids, and Lansdale had got a name for himself as a big dog in the ad world. Apparently, he'd played a key part in the monopoly and spread of Levi's jeans across the East Coast. He's got an unassuming presence. He's soft-spoken and modest. They say the only person who might be able to resist his charms would be Satan. Here's Michael.
Lansdale was a people person. Okay, he really loved interacting with people, even with his enemies. You have lots of stories about him interacting with a wide range of people, from government officials to military leaders and even everyday people. Of this kind of outgoing personality, I think, was crucial in enabling him to fit perfectly into this role assigned to him in the Philippines.
Lansdale had signed up to serve in the Second World War, and this eventually led him to the Philippines in 1945 with a brand new job in the Office of Strategic Services. This will later become the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. Now, by all accounts, during the war, Lansdale had become very interested in something he calls Psy-War, more widely known as PsyOps, psychological operations.
Most of the time, PsyOps just involves non-violent means of tricking the enemy into thinking that you're doing one thing, but actually you're doing something else.
PsyOps was used in both world wars, but in a way that was fairly transparent, like spreading propaganda via the radio or leaflets. Lansdale thought this didn't go far enough. He'll later write, "Conventional military men think of combat Psy-War almost exclusively in terms of leaflets or broadcasts appealing to the enemy to surrender. Early on, I realised that Psy-War had a wider potential than that." Armed with the beginnings of an idea in his new home of Manila, Lansdale had started to immerse himself in Filipino culture. He travelled the country in a jeep, exploring its rural areas and meeting the locals. He learned phrases in the local Tagalog language and just listened to the stories they told each other, their customs and the things they cared about. And one of the stories he took particular interest in involves something called an aswang.
The aswang is a very complex mythical figure to describe.
This is Allan Derain. He's an expert in Filipino literature and folklore. The aswang is one of the most feared monsters in Filipino folklore, which dates back to at least the 16th century. Allan says it's hard to describe, but what's clear is that it's an evil, shape-shifting creature.
In some Tagalog regions, the aswang is depicted as a beautiful young woman with straight pointed nose, long black hair, and very white complexion. She is usually a newcomer in town who would attract men to become her husband. Every night, they would suck the blood of their husband through a proboscis-like suction so the attempt would be painless. The victim slowly becomes anemic and grow weak, and from there would experience slow death.
There are other tales of aswangs appearing as an evil hound, a witch, or a vampire.
So the aswang is a contradiction of many things. It is both human and unhuman in one embodiment. It is the human other that lives within the human community.
The years pass, and we approach 1950. And aside from Filipino folklore, Lansdale is becoming very interested in one group in particular. On his travels, he keeps meeting young men, often peasant farmers, who are angry about the status quo. So they've become guerrilla fighters. They say they're called the Huks. By 1950, there are more than 15,000 Huks, active fighters, and they're gaining popularity. At least 100,000 people sympathise with their cause, and it's becoming clear that they pose a serious threat to the Philippine government and their American allies. And so a personal request goes out to Lansdale. He'd left the Philippines in 1948 to work in intelligence back in the US. But in 1950, he's back to head up the CIA's clandestine and paramilitary operations. His task? To get rid of the Huks. Michael Pante, the historian, says that from the Americans' perspective, Lansdale was the perfect man for the job. He seemed to care more about understanding the Huks than killing them. For example, Michael says that when he was trying to stave off a Huk rebellion in a particular region, Lansdale would go and meet them and just talk to them.
And in fact, he would strike a conversation with them, probably have a bottle of beer with them, smoke cigarettes with them, and encourage them to tell stories. And he would actively listen. What was their everyday life like? Who were these peasant Huks? What were their experiences? What preoccupied them during their spare time?
And so we come to the autumn of 1950. A group of Huks has set up camp just outside a village. And according to Lansdale, they've been threatening to kill landlords, anti-communists, and people they view as colonizers. So basically, Americans. So this is what Lansdale does. He sends out a cohort of his own, a CIA-trained combat Psy-War squad, Filipinos with clear instructions. They are to infiltrate the camp and spread a rumour. Following orders, his men enter the camp in disguise. They tell person after person that they've heard a horrifying rumour and that the Huks aren't alone in making this hill their home. There's a creature haunting the nearby woods, and it's hungry. The creature's name? An aswang. Lansdale's men spread the rumour and leave. And a few days later, after there's been enough time for the story to have spread, they strike. It's nighttime in the Huk camp, and the nightly patrol has just started. A group of soldiers leaves camp and heads out along one of their favoured trails. Looking left and right, they can't make much out in the dark, but they carry on along the trail undisturbed, one by one. We don't know the name of the man who comes last in the line. All we know is that at some point he's no longer part of the patrol. Lansdale's men have set up an ambush on the path, and as the patrol passes, they grab him silently. Following Lansdale's instructions, they kill him. They puncture his neck with 2 holes, about the distance apart of an aswang's front teeth, and hold the man's body up by his heels. The blood drains out of his neck. It may have taken as little as 3 minutes before he's pale and lifeless. Lansdale's men arrange the body across the trail, and leave it there. In Lansdale's own words, this is what happens next. When the Huks returned to look for the missing man and found their bloodless comrade, every member of the patrol believed that the Aswang had got him. According to Lansdale, the petrified Huks wait out the rest of the night, and when daylight arrives, they hastily pack up and leave. Here's Allan, the folklore expert.
They maintained that it was the Aswang's doing, and all of them are bound to have the same fate and would die of the same death if they don't leave the place. So the following day, the entire rebel squadron decided to come down from the mountain, and from then, people, especially the local politicians, were convinced that the Huks were really now gone, thanks to Lansdale's clever solution.
Or at least that's how the story goes. For years, the only people who know about what really happened on the night of the Aswang attack are those who were part of it. It will be another 2 decades before it's revealed that it was actually the CIA who was behind it all. Lansdale reveals all in his 1972 autobiography, In the Midst of Wars, an American's mission to Southeast Asia. He congratulates himself on pioneering an entirely new, much more dangerous form of psyops. But in the decades since then, academics have questioned how accurate his account actually is, including Allan Derain, the folklore expert.
Well, basically, my question really is, did the things Lansdale told in his memoir really happened? The details themselves are very dubious. The simulation, the 2 holes that was pricked from the neck of the victim, that was really a white man reimagining what an Aswang is. And I think he is working along the line of Western vampire. He's thinking much more in the line of Dracula, Nosferatu. The viscera sucker, or the what we call the manananggal in the Philippines, would use her long thread-like tongue to suck out the fetus inside a pregnant woman. So the modus is like that. So it's very far from the Western imaginings, really.
Allan points out that Lansdale was a master storyteller who was just playing out a different version of his advertising days.
Everything he did in the Philippines, whether the accounts really transpired or not, is along that line of advertisement, of commercialization, and using words, lies, for him to be able to get what he wants. So he can use really everything within his reach. One day it would be the Aswang stories, and the next day it would be Disney characters like Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse.
Stories like this just feed into racist assumptions about myth and folklore, according to Allan.
I think the entire affair reeks of racism, because the idea that Filipinos fighting for freedom can be easily spooked out by the eerie spectral assumes already that the natives have indeed the mind of a perpetual child. I don't think they would give up their own hideout because of an Aswang scare. Let's remember that this group of men Lansdale was talking of were not ordinary men, but guerrilla fighters.
Filipino academics have offered alternative explanations for why the Huks fled the hill that day. For instance, rumours that the CIA was nearby and they were draining bodies of blood.
Because basically it demeans the Huk movement.
What is clear, though, is that Lansdale doesn't stop there. Over the next few years, his PSYOPs campaign against the Huks only intensifies. He becomes very close with the Philippines Defense Secretary, a pro-American called Ramon Magsaysay, who shares Lansdale's PSYOPs ambitions. And together they form a group called Force X. These are Filipino soldiers who disguise themselves as Huks and infiltrate the insurgent ranks. Other reports say Lansdale orders planes to fly over villages and broadcast warnings in the local language that anyone hiding a Huk in their home will be cursed. Or, here's another tactic. Huk sympathizers come home to discover what Lansdale later calls the eye of God has been painted on their homes, a warning that death is coming for them. The psychological pressure, as well as malnutrition, disease, and dwindling weapons and ammo, becomes too much. By 1953, the Huks have lost the support of the wider population and have suffered huge defeats on the battlefield. They're scattered, demoralized, and no longer seen as a serious threat. Their once fearsome leader, Luis Taruk, has fled to the mountains. Ramon Magsaysay runs for president. Lansdale becomes a speechwriter and comes up with the slogan, "Magsaysay is my guy." Covert funds from the CIA and, amazingly, the Coca-Cola Company flow into the campaign. And on the 30th of December 1953, Lansdale's friend becomes the 7th president of the Philippines. It's later said Lansdale invented Magsaysay. 5 months later, Luis Taruk comes out of his hiding place and surrenders. The war is over, and the Huk leader is imprisoned for 15 years. And Lansdale? His task complete, he leaves the Philippines within a few weeks of Taruk's surrender and is reposted to Vietnam, where the threat of communism is growing. Lansdale's boss, the CIA director, tells him to do what he did in the Philippines. Lansdale's PSYOPs tactics will become central to the Americans' war of terror against the Soviet Union-backed North Vietnam, which lasts for 20 years, and his influence in Southeast Asia is solidified. Lansdale continues to work in the business of war through the 1950s and 60s. His first wife, Helen, dies in 1972, and a year later, he marries Patricinio Yapquincho, a Filipino woman he met during his travels there. He eventually dies at his home in Virginia of a heart ailment, aged 79. His legacy lives on, though. He became the inspiration for protagonists of various books and films, such as the harmonica-playing American officer in The Ugly American, a film featuring Marlon Brando. And so the question is, how does history remember figures such as these, and which parts of which stories do we choose to immortalize? Michael Pante, the historian, says Filipinos are still feeling the repercussions of Cold War interventionism by the US today.
Those scare tactics remain to be used, unfortunately, by the military establishment.
Michael says that the term red tagging has had a resurgence in the Philippines in recent years, meaning the labeling of certain people as communists. He says that more and more progressive politicians and activists are being red tagged as terrorists and enemies of the people, despite, according to Michael, a serious lack of evidence.
And that has led to numerous cases of red-tagged individuals being gunned down mercilessly in an extrajudicial fashion by vigilante groups wanting to exterminate all these communist terrorists in the Philippines. And that's the most damning assessment, I guess, of the impact of what Lansdale did, of what US interventionism did in the Cold War.
This was True Crime Reports, a global crime series from Al Jazeera. In our next episode, we're in South Carolina, where in 1944, a 14-year-old black boy called George Stinney was executed for a crime that 70 years later, his family is still fighting to prove he did not commit. Thank you for joining. See you next week.